This experience happened to me when I was 14 years old. I haven't spoken to anyone about this event since it happened. Not even my significant other. At the time of writing this, I'm 20 years old, about to major in my first 2 degrees in psychology and anthropology. Recently, for reasons that are unknown to me, the memories of this strange happening have resurfaced and are continuing to plague my waking thoughts, as well as my unconscious and subconscious. As we are taught in psychology, talking about the situation could help with repressed trauma. So here it goes. I live in the high desert mountains of Southern California, situated just below the Sierra Nevadas, about 30 minutes west of Mojave. My town is no booming metropolis. At the time, our largest store was Kmart, one of the last still in operation, I might add, and we only had a total of 4 stoplights in town. This takes place in a subsection of the town, about 13 miles away from the shops, banks, and restaurants, in a small community largely inhabited by retirees. It's smack dab in the middle of summer, and the temperatures are well into the high 90s to low hundreds. My nightly routine would consist of walking my Australian Shepherd. However, I would wait until it was almost dark to avoid the heat. I grabbed my phone, a small pocket knife, some headphones, my pup, and set out for my nightly walk. My community is also home to a significant amount of equestrian riders, as well as cattle ranchers. The trails I walked were designated horse riding trails set between pastures. I decided to take a horse trail that stretches for approximately 2 miles between back-to-back paddocks. It's basically a long, narrow trail that's situated between very large backyards. My ending destination is the Equestrian Center, a sort of communal park for horseback riders. Making my way through the sandy terrain of the trail, it was nearly dark now. The sky was becoming a deeper shade of blue every time I looked up, and my dog was becoming more difficult to see. I estimated my arrival at the Equestrian Center would be about 15 minutes from my current position, so I texted my mother. "I'll be at the Equestrian Center in about 15 minutes. Could you meet me there? I'm too tired to walk back." "Sure, I'll leave in 10 minutes. My mother replied. Now at this point, I was just outside the east entrance of the center, where the forest trail connects to the trail that I was on, sort of like a 3-way intersection. You can either go left into the forest, or you can go straight into the Equestrian Center. Before I reached the intersection, I noticed a shift in my dog's behavior as she becomes anxious and seemingly worried. She had her eyes fixated to the forest and stopped dead in her tracks. I played it off. She may have noticed another animal in the forest, like a bobcat or a boar, as they weren't uncommon in this area. I gave a slight tug on her collar, although she was still incessantly focused on the forest. With a bit more convincing, I was able to get her moving forward, pushing towards the center, where my mom would be waiting for our arrival. Now it was nearly pitch black, with only the moon guiding me. There was just the slightest of visibility, forcing me to turn on my cell phone's dim flashlight. Entering the Equestrian Center now, I noticed something that startled me. A very tall person, a man, about 10 to 15 feet into the forest trail, with his back toward me, standing completely still. His head was facing the sky, and his hands were open, palms pointing in front of him, while his arms were at his side. He was approximately 6 feet tall, slim build, short dark hair, and was wearing what looked to be light blue scrubs, or at least a very thin blue material, and he was barefoot. What startled me the most was his demeanor and what he was doing. His stance was enough to scare me in that setting, but as I approached him slowly, it appeared to me he was shaking, vibrating, or slightly convulsing, but doing so while standing up. It didn't seem like he had any control over it, although he maintained his balance perfectly. Scared and not entirely sure of what to do, I asked him, "Hello, excuse me?" I paused momentarily and slightly raised my voice with my next question. "Is everything all right?" When I say that, he stops shaking altogether, but still doesn't turn around or move another muscle. He just maintains that same creepy position and doesn't move. For a brief moment, I thought I might have been imagining this. I glanced down at my dog, and she also seemed concerned with the state and condition of this man, and began growling quietly. I then knew that this wasn't in my head. When I looked back up, he had moved closer to us, about 7 feet or so, almost on my trail's path. I only looked at my dog for a split second, and he moved closer to us without making a sound, and he still wasn't facing me either. His hands were still open and his head was still facing the sky. I wasn't about to wait and see what this guy was doing or what his intentions were. So slowly, I eased my way past him, as quietly as I could, before I felt that I was at a safe enough distance to start sprinting as fast as I could away from this guy. When I got to the first arena of the center, I looked back in the direction of the forest, and there he was. He was now standing on the edge of the trail outside the forest, as still as a statue, now facing me. At this point, I was too far away to see his face, and frankly, I didn't want to. All I could see was his silhouette, illuminated by the moonlight, peeking out through the forest trail. I continued to run with no intention of stopping until I found someone. I had never been so happy to see my naggy neighbor, Penny. She was riding around her moody mare, Jolene. She noticed my distress, but due to her already harsh opinions of me, I told her that I had been on an endurance run, and I was just very tired and out of breath. I wanted to avoid small-town gossip as much as I could. My mother arrived with impeccable timing. During the drive home, I broke down in a state of paranoia, distress, and panic at what I had just witnessed. My mother didn't know exactly what to make of it, so she recommended that I file a police report. About an hour after getting home, an officer shows up to take my statement. Following up the next day, the same officer claimed that he went and checked out the area, but didn't find anyone or anything out of the blue, apart from some partial bare footprints. But there's nothing incriminating about someone going for a walk without shoes. He played it off as a joke and accused me of being under the influence. I can assure you, I was completely sober. Nothing ever came of this. I attended weekly therapy sessions for almost 2 years following this event, and never went out for walks by myself ever again. I've had night terrors about the man, and I still sometimes do. I don't know what to make of it, and I don't think I ever will. In the summer of 2019, my partner and I, both in our early 20s, decided to take a road trip to Vancouver, Canada, and stay at the Golden Ears Provincial Park. We enjoyed camping, and had done so over spring break, but we wanted a change of scenery for our summer vacation. My partner had never been outside of the US, and going to Canada seemed like a crazy new experience. It was a 6-day trip with Airbnbs in each state, with the grand finale being the reserved campsite at Golden Ears, which was close to Alouette Lake. We packed a giant tent, brought along a bunch of fruits and vegetables to eat healthy, storing them in a cooler that was a bit too small. And we also brought a cutting board and knife to break up the snacks while driving. We began in California and switched off driving our bright red Ford Fiesta. We spent a day or two in Oregon and Washington State. We drank a little too much, but we finally made it to Vancouver. Canada was by far the best part. Alouette Lake felt like walking in a painting. We stepped barefoot on the rocks with our toes in the freezing water, hiked around for a while, and came across this breathtaking waterfall where we saw a couple taking pictures of each other. And we started doing the same. Everything was perfect, and the campsite was empty, except for that other couple I mentioned. We went to bed early that night. All was quiet. I woke up to a rustling sound outside of our tent. My partner was still asleep and snoring. I didn't think much of it because it was pitch black, and it was most likely an animal scurrying around out there. However, the sound continued to move closer to our tent. I sat up and grabbed my phone. The brightness came on, and I quickly turned it off, almost blinding myself in the process. In those couple of seconds, I could make out a figure right outside of our tent. I froze and sat up. They weren't moving, and they were close enough to unzip the tent flap. I started tapping my partner because I had no idea what to do in this situation. When she woke up, I said, "There's somebody outside of our tent." We then heard footsteps walking out of our campsite. My partner, still half asleep, says, "What?" We then hear the engine of a vehicle start up. I then poked my head out of the tent. There was a vehicle parked outside of our camping area. Whoever had been outside of our tent was now gone. However, the vehicle slowly backs up, turns around, then drives away. They didn't turn on their headlights until they turned the corner. I couldn't make out much, but it looked like it was a truck. Now I'm shaking, and my partner still can't put together what was happening. I wanted to leave, but Golden Ears locks their gates until around 6 or 7 a.m., and at this point it was 1 o'clock in the morning, so we were going to be here for a while longer. We get back into the Ford and decided to sleep in there for the rest of the night. She falls asleep almost immediately, thinking that I was being paranoid about this whole thing. "Maybe it was a park ranger or something," she said to me right before she passed out. Their behavior was too creepy to be a park ranger. I sat there wide awake for about 2 hours. The car was locked, and I wanted to get some sleep, but I couldn't. I was in the passenger seat. My partner was on the driver's side, fast asleep. It was now 3 a.m. I'm still half awake, sort of drifting off, when I hear a vehicle slowly driving up the road. I saw that its lights were off as it rounded the corner. It had to be that same truck. I was now frightened, but my adrenaline was pumping. The truck slowly rounds the corner and pulls up directly in front of our campsite, in the same exact spot it was before. I feel like I'm going to throw up. I grabbed the kitchen knife we had brought for the fruits and vegetables and tried my best to prepare myself for a confrontation. I sat up in the passenger seat, gripping the knife in my hand. Wide-eyed, I stared out into the darkness from the passenger side window, directly at the truck, which seemed to be staring right back at me. The truck's engine suddenly turns off, and a light shines directly into my face, coming from the side of the truck. I stare back, terrified, still holding my large kitchen knife, not moving a muscle. The truck starts up again, and this time they stay on, blinding me. After a while, the truck pulls out and turns around back where it came. My heart was pounding, I wake up my partner. "Hey, listen, whoever was outside of our tent came back. We gotta get the hell out of here now." We packed by just throwing things into our car and sat there until 6 a.m. We then drove directly home, not stopping once. We kept rehashing the events of that night, trying to make sense of the situation. But by the time we got back, we ultimately decided that we both needed some sleep. A friend of mine shared my story on Reddit about 6 months ago, and he told a pretty faithful version of the events, but I'd like to tell it myself to give a bit more detail. One summer a few years ago, I took my 2 kids, ages 3 and 5, out for the day to give my wife a break. I had heard about a hiking trail that had a 15-foot elevation gain and was in a remote area. Something that my friend neglected to mention is that I didn't plan on hiking on that trail that day. I was just kind of killing time and scoping it out for a possible hiking trip in the future. The kids and I had done other things that day, and this was just a stop on the way back home. It is in a remote area, but the town is only about a 15-minute drive from there, so it's not exactly no man's land. When we got there and made our way to the trail, I quickly saw that the terrain was too steep and rugged for the children, and we just hung out at the trail's entrance. We eventually headed back to my truck. There was about a half a mile between the parking area and the trail's entrance. There were many trails in this area, but ours was a bit further away. As my truck came into view, I noticed a figure standing by it. As we got closer, I saw that it was a man, looking into the driver's side window. He then got on the ground and began looking underneath the engine well. After that, he got up and then climbed into the bed of the truck. During this whole time, the kids and I were still walking towards the truck, so I decided that I wouldn't say anything until we got a bit closer, and hopefully by then, the man would notice us and take off. For the first time in a very long time, I became genuinely afraid. Here I was in a remote area of Utah with my 2 young kids, and saw this unknown person trying to break into my truck, or even possibly ambush us. When we got about halfway, that's when I told my kids to stop. Now, something that I've noticed in these stories is that no one is ever armed during these encounters. However, here in Utah, we like our guns, and I did in fact have my pistol on me. "Hey you, get away from my truck and get the hell out of here," I shouted. I saw the man's head peek out from the bed, but he stayed put. I then told my kids to stay back and cover their ears as I fired a warning shot, which landed on the ground near the truck. The man then hopped out of the bed, then kneeled down behind the truck for a few moments before getting back up and taking off down the road. When we eventually reached my truck, I discovered that all 4 of my tires had been slashed. When I first saw him checking under the engine, he must have stabbed the front tires. Additionally, he also sabotaged a fuel tank I had in the back, stabbing holes through it, causing the gasoline to go everywhere. One spark would have ignited the truck into an inferno. There was now no way out, and we could still see the man walking in the distance. At first, he appeared to be walking away, but he eventually started coming back toward us. Thankfully, my phone still had service, and I immediately called 911. I would put a bullet in this guy's head if I had to, but better to have the police deal with him. Before the guy could reach us, the police arrived, sirens blaring. He fled into a nearby forest, and the police gave chase on foot. However, they wouldn't catch him that night. It wouldn't be for another 2 years until we finally got closure. A man named Jason Pogg was arrested in connection to this event and many other crimes in the Book Cliffs of Utah. It turns out he was a transient living in a nearby ghost town called Woodside. If you look up his name, you can see he's still having run-ins with the police to this day. I was pissed off about what happened to my truck, but ultimately I'm grateful that my kids weren't harmed. I don't know what Jason was planning on doing to us, but with the entire bed of my truck drenched in gasoline, the implications are truly terrifying.